The dog wouldn't stop clawing at the south shed, like something buried under the mountain still wanted out. Snow slapped against the side of the old RV, while Walter Hayes stumbled through another nightmare, half awake and reaching for a rifle that wasn't there anymore. Ranger was already barking at the darkness outside. Not at the road, not at the woods, at the locked south shed behind his father's barn. The old German shepherd kept clawing at the frozen dirt like he could smell something alive underneath it. Would you have opened that shed or walked away? The wind coming off the river carried the kind of cold that slipped through cracked glass and worn jackets like it belonged there. It rattled the loose aluminum siding of Walter Hayes's RV and made the whole thing creak softly in the dark. Walter jerked awake before he understood where he was. Metal clanged somewhere outside. His body reacted first. Breath sharp, heart hammering, hands already searching for something that wasn't there anymore. For half a second, the riverbank outside disappeared. The dark became heat and dust and smoke. A convoy road, broken concrete, somebody shouting over comms. Then a heavy weight pressed against his chest. Warm fur, steady breathing. Walter blinked hard. "Easy," he muttered. Ranger had climbed halfway onto the narrow bed, his large paws planted carefully against Walter's ribs. The old German shepherd stared at him with tired amber eyes. Calm eyes. Working eyes. Walter rested a trembling hand against the dog's neck. "I'm all right." The dog kept staring. Walter let out a slow breath and leaned his head back against the wall of the RV. Outside, a truck groaned along the mountain road above the river lot. Its trailer rattled over loose pavement. That explained the sound. Ranger finally stepped down and circled once before lying beside the bed again. Walter checked the time on his flip phone. 3:12 a.m. He closed his eyes, but sleep was gone now. The heater hadn't worked right in 2 winters. Frost crept around the corners of the windows. A coffee can full of loose change sat beside the sink. 3 unpaid parking tickets were tucked beneath an ashtray he no longer used. Everything in the RV smelled faintly like wet denim, old coffee, and dog fur. Home for now. By sunrise, the river had turned silver beneath the bare trees. Walter stepped outside, wearing 2 flannel shirts under a faded army jacket. Ranger followed close behind, moving slower than he used to, but still alert to everything around them. The public fishing lot sat mostly empty in winter. Just Walter's RV and an old pickup with Ohio plates parked near the boat ramp. Walter poured stale coffee from a dented thermos and watched steam drift into the cold air. Ranger sniffed along the gravel edge near the water. "You're getting picky in your old age," Walter said. The dog ignored him. A few hours later, Walter was behind Miller's Hardware, unloading 50-pound bags of rock salt from a delivery truck. Cash work, no paperwork, no questions. His left shoulder burned every time he lifted. The younger guy unloading with him kept talking about college football, while Walter counted pallets in his head to stay focused. 12 more. 11. 10. The loading dock slammed unexpectedly behind him. Walter spun fast enough that the younger worker nearly dropped a bag. "Damn, man," the kid said. "You all right?" Walter's pulse pounded hard in his neck. Ranger, waiting near the truck, stood immediately. Walter swallowed once. "Fine." The kid gave him a strange look but didn't ask again. Most people stopped asking after a while. By afternoon, Walter had $60 folded in his pocket and pain crawling through his lower back. He bought Ranger a fresh bag of kibble before buying himself dinner. That part never changed. Near dusk, he parked beside the river again. Gray clouds hung low over the Appalachian hills. Smoke drifted from chimneys across town. Somewhere farther up the ridge, a train horn echoed through the valley. Walter sat inside the RV eating canned chili straight from the pot. Ranger rested near the door. "You ever think we should gone south?" Walter asked quietly. One ear twitched. "Florida, maybe. Less snow." Ranger looked at him once, then lowered his head again. Walter smiled faintly despite himself. The phone rang just after dark. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Almost. "Yeah, is this Walter Hayes?" Female voice. Professional, careful. "Depends who's asking. My name's Linda Carver. I'm calling from Mercer County General." Walter stared through the windshield at the river. "We've been trying to reach you regarding your father, Earl Hayes." The name landed heavier than he expected. Walter said nothing. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. Your father passed away yesterday morning. Heart failure, according to the attending physician." The RV suddenly felt smaller. Ranger lifted his head immediately. Walter rubbed a hand over his face. "You sure you got the right guy?" "Yes, sir. You were listed as next of kin." Next of kin. He hadn't spoken to Earl in almost 8 years. The last conversation ended with a slammed screen door, and Walter driving away before sunrise with a duffel bag in the passenger seat. "What happens now?" Walter asked. "There are personal belongings at the property. Also," the woman hesitated, "the county filed foreclosure paperwork last month. I thought you should know." Walter looked down at the cracked floor beneath his boots. Same old Earl. Too stubborn to ask for help. Too proud to leave. "Sir, I'm here. The bank scheduled an auction review. If the estate isn't addressed soon, the property may transfer." Transfer. Sold off. Bulldozed maybe. Walter thanked her without remembering the exact words. Then the line went dead. For a long time, only the river moved. Ranger stood and pressed his nose against Walter's arm. "He's gone," Walter said quietly. The dog stayed there. Walter laughed once, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Hell of a thing, huh?" Outside, the wind shook the bare branches overhead. Walter remembered Earl standing in the driveway years ago with grease on his hands and disappointment written all over his face. The man never knew how to talk without sounding angry. Walter never knew how to stay without feeling trapped. By midnight, Walter still hadn't decided. He sat at the tiny table inside the RV staring at an old road map of West Virginia. Mercer County sat circled near the bottom corner. 300 miles. Ranger walked over and rested his chin on Walter's knee. "You want to go back there?" The dog blinked slowly. Walter looked toward the dark windshield. He thought about the foreclosure notice, the unpaid taxes, the empty farmhouse sitting alone in winter. Mostly, he thought about leaving things unfinished. At dawn, Walter started the RV on the third try. The engine coughed hard before finally catching. Ranger climbed into the passenger seat without being told. The river lot disappeared behind them as they headed deeper into the mountains. By late afternoon, Walter pulled into the cracked, gravel driveway of the old Hayes property for the first time in nearly a decade. The farmhouse looked smaller than he remembered. Older, too. Rust stained the tin roof. One shutter hung crooked beside the upstairs window. The porch steps sagged under years of weather. Walter stood there a long moment while Ranger sniffed the frozen ground around the truck. No smoke from the chimney, no lights, no Earl, just silence. Inside the garage, dust coated everything. Tools hung exactly where Earl had left them. Coffee cans full of bolts lined the shelves. Walter found the old metal toolbox beneath a workbench. He almost didn't open it. Almost. Inside were rusted sockets, screwdrivers, loose receipts, and a pair of cracked reading glasses. Then, beneath an oil-stained rag, his fingers touched cold iron. Walter slowly pulled out a rusted key wrapped in faded cloth. Something else fell into his lap. A folded piece of paper. His father's handwriting. Short. Uneven. Don't sell the south shed. Walter read the note 3 times before folding it again. The garage smelled like cold iron and old oil. Dust floated through the weak afternoon light, slipping between the wooden boards. Somewhere outside, Ranger barked once near the tree line. Walter slid the rusted key back into the toolbox. "Jesus, Dad," he muttered. The south shed sat about 50 yards behind the house, near the edge of the property. Walter could barely see its roof through the dead winter grass and leaning fence posts. He remembered it from when he was a kid, mostly because Earl never let him near it. "Roof's unstable," his father used to say. Or sometimes, "Nothing in there worth fooling with." Walter had stopped asking after a while. Now the place looked ready to collapse completely. By evening, the temperature dropped hard. Walter parked the RV beside the barn, instead of sleeping inside the house. The farmhouse felt too quiet, too full of old ghosts. Ranger circled the property twice before settling near the RV door. Walter sat at the tiny table with a flashlight and another can of chili. The key rested beside his elbow. He kept looking at it, not because it seemed valuable, because Earl had hidden it. That part bothered him. His father never hid anything. Earl Hayes believed in leaving tools exactly where they belonged and saying things plain enough to sting. Walter rubbed tired eyes. Outside, wind scraped loose tin somewhere on the property. Metal against metal. The sound tightened something deep in his chest before he could stop it. Instantly alert. Listening. Waiting. Ranger lifted his head too. Walter forced himself to breathe slower. Not Iraq, not Afghanistan. Just wind. Still, sleep came rough. He woke before dawn with sweat cooling under his shirt and his pulse hammering hard enough to hurt. Ranger stood beside the bed, already watching him. "I know," Walter whispered. The dog pressed against his leg until the shaking eased. Gray morning settled over the valley. Frost coated the dead weeds around the house. Walter stepped outside carrying a travel mug of burnt coffee, while Ranger headed straight toward the south side of the property. Not wandering, purposeful. Walter frowned and followed. The shed leaned slightly downhill against a cluster of bare maple trees. Old corrugated roofing rattled softly overhead. One window had been covered with plywood years ago. The padlock on the door looked ancient. Ranger sniffed along the bottom edge, then pawed once at the dirt beside the concrete step. "You smell mice or something?" The dog ignored him. Walter tried the rusted key. It stuck halfway. He twisted harder. For a second, nothing happened. Then the lock gave with a rough metallic snap. The sound echoed strangely in the cold air. Walter hesitated before opening the door. The smell hit first: damp wood, earth, motor oil. The shed was smaller inside than he remembered. Shelves lined the walls, holding cracked mason jars, rusted traps, old paint cans, broken tools nobody would steal. A workbench sat beneath the covered window. Everything looked untouched for years. Ranger moved immediately toward the back corner. His nails clicked sharply against concrete. Walter watched the dog lower his nose to the floor. Sniff. Pause. Sniff again. Then Ranger let out a low sound deep in his throat. Not aggressive, focused. Walter stepped closer. The concrete looked uneven there, one section darker than the rest. He crouched slowly, brushing dirt aside with his glove. A metal ring sat, nearly hidden beneath dust, near the edge of the floor. Walter stared at it. No way. He hooked his fingers through the ring and pulled. The square section resisted at first, then shifted upward with a dry scraping sound. Cold air drifted out from below. Ranger backed up one step, but never took his eyes off the opening. Under the concrete hatch sat a narrow staircase disappearing into darkness. Walter laughed softly under his breath. Old man. He grabbed the flashlight from his jacket pocket and aimed it downward. Stone walls, wooden shelves. A cellar, not some secret bunker. Just an old Appalachian root cellar built deep into the hillside decades earlier. Plenty of farms used to have them before refrigeration became common. Still, Earl had hidden this one carefully. Walter descended slowly. The steps creaked beneath his boots. The air smelled dry and cool underground, better preserved than upstairs, somehow. Rows of shelves filled the small room below. Most held empty jars and water-stained boxes. Then Walter's flashlight landed on the filing boxes stacked neatly against the far wall. 6 of them, all labeled in black marker. Pierce, Whitlock, Grady, Miller, names, family names, local names. Walter stepped closer. Ranger remained at the bottom of the stairs, watching the room carefully, ears twitching at every small sound. Walter opened the nearest box. Inside were folders packed tight with papers, property maps, bank notices, lease agreements, handwritten notes clipped to legal documents. He pulled one file free. A widow named Ruth Miller had signed mineral rights paperwork 11 years earlier. Several pages were highlighted in yellow marker. Earl's handwriting covered the margins. Didn't understand Clause 8. No lawyer present. Payment never matched contract. Walter frowned. He opened another folder. Then another. Every box held the same thing. Land records, debt notices, foreclosure letters, notes about families around the valley. Ranger moved quietly through the cellar, sniffing corners before finally settling beside Walter near the boxes. Walter leaned back against the wall slowly. "What were you doing down here?" His flashlight beam drifted across the room again. More notes, dates, names he recognized from town. This wasn't random hoarding. Earl had organized everything carefully. Walter picked up one yellowed envelope, addressed in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for helping Paul understand the papers. We would have signed without reading them." No signature, just initials. Walter stared at the letter longer than he meant to. Footsteps crunched faintly outside above them. He froze instantly. Ranger stood at the same moment. Silence. Walter killed the flashlight. Darkness swallowed the cellar. His breathing slowed automatically the way training taught him years ago. Listen first. Move second. Ranger stared toward the ceiling, body tense but silent. Another crunch, then nothing. Probably a deer, probably. Still, Walter stayed motionless, nearly a full minute before switching the flashlight back on. The room returned in pale yellow light. His pulse remained elevated. "You're getting jumpy," he muttered to himself. But Ranger kept staring toward the stairs. Walter looked down at the open boxes again. Whatever Earl had been doing, he'd hidden it underground for a reason. And suddenly the old man's note didn't sound strange anymore. "Don't sell the south shed." Walter reached for another folder just as Ranger stepped closer and pressed his nose against a second box near the wall. This one wasn't labeled with a family name, only a single word written in black marker. Mercer. Walter stared at the box for a long moment before opening it. Inside were thinner folders than the others. Cleaner, too. No water stains. No torn edges. Recent. Ranger stayed the cellar stairs, watching upward while Walter flipped through the first file. Property surveys. Copies of county zoning maps. Letters from Mercer Energy Holdings. Most of it looked ordinary at first glance. Corporate paperwork. Land offers. Tax assessments. Then Walter found Earl's notes written across the margins in thick pencil. Pressure tactics. Change terms after signing. Check parcel 14 again. A folded newspaper clipping slipped from one folder and landed near Walter's boot. Local family forced to sell after foreclosure. Walter remembered the place. Small cattle farm north of the river. Gone now. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. What the hell were you mixed up in, Dad? Ranger suddenly turned toward the stairs. Walter froze. The dog's ears lifted sharply. A truck engine rumbled faintly somewhere outside near the road. Not close, but close enough. Walter switched off the flashlight again automatically. Silence filled the cellar. The engine faded. After a few seconds, swallowed by the hills. Still, Walter waited before breathing normally again. His body had never fully learned the difference between caution and danger. After a while, Ranger relaxed first. Walter switched the light back on. By late morning, he carried 2 boxes up into the farmhouse kitchen. Dust coated the table. Sunlight pushed weakly through the dirty windows. The place felt less abandoned now. Not alive exactly, but occupied by something unfinished. Walter brewed coffee strong enough to taste burnt and sat reading through file after file while Ranger slept near the door. The deeper Walter looked, the stranger it got. Families losing land after confusing lease agreements. Elderly homeowners signing papers without attorneys present. Mineral rights separated from property ownership in ways most people wouldn't understand unless somebody explained it carefully. Earl had explained it carefully. Over and over, apparently. Walter found handwritten notes clipped to several folders. Mrs. Pierce cried after meeting. Mr. Grady thought payment was yearly, was actually one time. Tell Ben Whitlock not to sign anything new. Walter leaned back in his chair. He remembered being 15 years old and hearing people in town call Earl difficult, bitter. A man always looking for fights that weren't his business. Maybe this had been the business. Near noon, Walter drove into town for supplies. The truck rattled badly downhill toward Main Street. Ranger sat in the passenger seat with his head near the cracked window, nose working constantly. The town looked smaller than Walter remembered, too. A laundromat had closed. The old pharmacy was now empty. Only Naomi's diner looked exactly the same. The bell above the door jingled softly when Walter stepped inside. Warm air and bacon grease hit him immediately. A few older men sat near the counter drinking coffee in silence, beneath a television tuned to weather reports. Naomi Pierce looked up from behind the register. For a second, she just stared. Well, she said quietly, either I'm getting old or Walter Hayes finally came home. Walter gave a faint nod. Naomi walked around the counter and hugged him before he could stop her. You look skinny, she said. You always said that, because it keeps being true. Ranger settled beside the booth while Walter ordered coffee and eggs. Naomi slid into the seat across from him instead of walking away. I heard about Earl, she said softly. Walter looked out the window toward the frozen street. Yeah, he talked about you, Walter snorted lightly. Can't imagine those were cheerful conversations. Naomi studied him for a moment. No, she said, mostly worried ones. That caught him off guard. He stirred his coffee without drinking it. Naomi lowered her voice. Your daddy was stubborn. Lord knows that. But he wasn't crazy. Walter glanced at her. I found boxes in the shed. Naomi didn't seem surprised. Then you found what kept him awake. She explained slowly after that. How Earl spent years helping older folks read contracts from energy companies buying land around the valley. Nothing illegal about buying land, but plenty of people signed things they barely understood. Especially older folks with debt, or medical bills, or kids who moved away and stopped visiting. Walter felt that last part settle heavier than the rest. Most people thought Earl should mind his own business, Naomi said. But your father never handled watching people get cornered very well. Walter stared down into his coffee. Neither did I. The thought came fast and unwelcome. Before he could answer, the diner bell rang again. A man in a dark wool coat stepped inside, mid-50s maybe. Clean boots, expensive watch, the kind of haircut that stayed sharp even in winter wind. He spotted Walter immediately, too quickly. "Well," the man said with an easy smile. "Guess introductions aren't necessary." Walter didn't stand. The man walked over anyway and extended a hand. "Clay Mercer." Walter looked at the hand but didn't take it. Ranger lifted his head. Mercer didn't seem bothered. "I was sorry to hear about Earl," he said. "Your father and I disagreed plenty, but nobody likes seeing an old-timer go." Naomi's expression cooled instantly. "What do you want, Clay?" "Business, mostly." Mercer pulled out the chair across from Walter without asking. "There's interest in the Hayes property," he said calmly. "Always has been. We'd like to make the transition easier on everybody involved." Walter stayed quiet. Mercer folded his hands neatly. "You inherited a difficult situation. Taxes, foreclosure pressure, structural issues." He smiled slightly. "That land's more burden than blessing these days." Ranger let out a low rumble. Small, controlled. Mercer glanced down at the dog. "Beautiful shepherd," Walter finally spoke. "What exactly are you offering?" "A clean purchase." Mercer leaned back. "Enough money to settle debts and put something in your pocket besides trouble." Naomi crossed her arms. "Funny timing," she muttered. Mercer ignored her. Walter watched the man carefully now. The measured voice, the steady eye contact. No rush. Salesman calm. "How much?" Mercer named a number larger than Walter expected. Large enough to buy another RV. Maybe even a small apartment somewhere warmer. For one dangerous second, Walter imagined taking it. Driving south. Leaving the whole valley behind again. Then he remembered the boxes underground. The handwritten notes. The people Earl had spent years trying to help. Mercer reached into his coat pocket and slid over a business card. "No pressure today," he said. "Just think it over." Ranger stood slowly beside the booth, not barking, not aggressive, but focused hard enough that Mercer noticed. The man's smile thinned just slightly. "Dogs usually like me," he said. Walter took the card at last. "Ranger's picky." Mercer rose from the table. "Well, I hope we can help each other, Mr. Hayes." He walked out into the cold street without another word. The diner stayed quiet after the door closed. Naomi exhaled slowly. "That man's been buying land all over this county," she said. Walter turned the business card over in his hand. "Mercer Energy Holdings." Same name on the seller boxes. Outside, snow began falling lightly across Main Street. Ranger kept staring through the window long after Clay Mercer disappeared from sight. That night, Walter returned to the farmhouse uneasy, in a way he couldn't quite explain. The valley felt different now. Smaller, watching. He carried another box from the cellar into the kitchen after dark. Ranger stayed close enough that Walter nearly tripped over him twice. "Relax," Walter muttered. Then he heard it metal, scraping outside. Slow, heavy, behind the south shed. Ranger was already on his feet before Walter moved. The dog's growl rolled low through the dark farmhouse. Walter reached instinctively toward his hip for something that hadn't been there in years. The scraping came again. Closer this time. Walter killed the kitchen light immediately. The farmhouse dropped into darkness except for the pale moonlight leaking through the curtains. Ranger stood stiff beside the table, ears forward, chest rumbling low. Another scrape, metal against concrete. Behind the shed, Walter's pulse kicked hard. Not panic, pattern recognition. His body already mapping exits and sight lines before his mind caught up. He moved toward the mudroom quietly and grabbed Earl's old flashlight from a shelf beside the back door. Heavy steel, cold in his hand. Ranger stayed glued to his leg. Walter cracked the back door open. Winter air hit him sharp in the face. The yard looked silver beneath the moon. Dead grass bent under thin frost. The shed sat dark near the tree line. For a second, nothing moved. Then the wind pushed the loose roofing again. Scrape. Walter exhaled slowly. "Damn roof," he muttered. But Ranger didn't relax. The dog stepped ahead into the yard, nose low. Walter followed carefully. His boots crunched softly across frozen dirt. The farther they moved from the house, the quieter everything became. No traffic, no river, just wind through bare trees. Ranger stopped near the shed door. The flashlight beam landed on the padlock. Walter froze. Fresh scratches covered the metal around the latch. Bright silver beneath the rust. Very recent. "Somebody tried it," he whispered. Ranger sniffed the ground beside the doorway and suddenly pulled toward the back of the shed. Walter rounded the corner carefully. 2 muddy boot prints sat clearly beneath the window. Not his, too narrow. One deeper than the other, like somebody had shifted weight climbing up. Walter swept the flashlight higher. The plywood over the window had fresh pry marks along one edge. His stomach tightened. Somebody knew about the shed, or at least suspected something worth looking for. Ranger let out another low growl toward the woods beyond the property. Walter turned fast, flashlight cutting through trees and brush. Nothing there. Still, the feeling remained. Being watched. The old pressure behind his ribs started building before he could stop it. His breathing shortened. The dark tree line blurred for half a second into another place entirely. Another night, another perimeter check in another country years ago. He heard rotor wash, distant shouting, the smell of dust and burned wiring. Walter shut his eyes hard. Not now. Ranger immediately pressed against his leg. Solid weight. Real weight. Walter focused on the dog's breathing until the shaking eased. When he opened his eyes again, only the woods remained. Cold, silent, empty. He checked the shed once more before heading back toward the house. Inside, he locked both doors for the first time since arriving. Sleep barely came after that. Every creak of the farmhouse dragged him awake. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. By morning, the valley looked washed pale beneath low gray clouds. Walter carried fresh coffee toward the shed while Ranger trotted ahead. The boot prints remained, clearer now in daylight. One set heading toward the woods, one returning toward the road. Walter crouched beside them. Work boots, probably size 10 or 11. Deep heel wear, not kids messing around. Purposeful. Ranger pawed lightly near the shed entrance again. "I know," Walter said quietly. Inside the cellar, Walter noticed it immediately. The second box from the Mercer stack sat crooked. His chest tightened. He crossed the room fast and opened it. Folders were missing. Not all, just a few. Enough to matter. Walter stared at the empty space between the files. Somebody had already been through here. Ranger sniffed the floor near the shelves and paced once in tight circles. Walter checked the rest of the cellar carefully. Nothing else disturbed, no smashed locks, no broken shelves. Whoever came knew exactly what they wanted. Back in the farmhouse kitchen, Walter spread the remaining papers across the table. Several missing folders involved families whose land had already been sold to Mercer Energy years earlier. That didn't feel accidental. Around noon, Walter drove back into town. Clouds hung heavy over Main Street. A light snow had started falling again. Ranger rested his head near the passenger window as Walter parked outside Naomi's diner. The lunch crowd had thinned when he stepped inside. Naomi looked up immediately. "You look worse today," she said. "Somebody got into the shed last night." That wiped the softness off her face. Walter slid into the booth while Ranger settled underneath. They take anything. Fonders. Naomi stayed quiet for a second too long. You know who? Walter shook his head. Not yet. She poured coffee into his mug without asking. Then she sat down across from him. Few years back, she said carefully, people stopped talking openly about those land contracts. Walter listened. Not because they forgot, Naomi continued. Because some folks got nervous. Nervous how? She glanced toward the counter before lowering her voice. Pressure, mostly. Men showing up asking questions. Calls late at night. People being reminded they still owed money. Walter leaned back slowly. Earl kept pushing anyway, Naomi snorted softly. Your father didn't know how to quit once he thought something was wrong. Walter stared down at the steam rising from his coffee. Neither do I. The thought bothered him. Naomi reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small envelope. He left this here maybe 6 months ago, she said. Told me to hand it to you if you ever came back. Walter frowned and opened it carefully. Inside sat an old cassette tape. Black plastic. Worn label. 3 words written in Earl's rough handwriting. If you finally came home. Walter swallowed hard. Naomi watched his face carefully. He thought you would someday, she said quietly. Walter turned the cassette over in his hand. When's the last time you saw him? Couple weeks before Christmas. Naomi sighed. He looked tired, real tired. Outside, a truck rolled slowly past the diner windows. Walter glanced up automatically. A dark company pickup. Mercer Energy logo on the door. It didn't stop, but it didn't feel random either. Naomi noticed his expression. You all right? Walter looked back down at the tape. No, he admitted honestly. Not really. The diner stayed quiet around them. Coffee cups clinked. Somebody laughed near the kitchen. Normal sounds. But Walter felt something shifting beneath all of it now. Like the valley had layers he never noticed growing up. Layers Earl spent years digging through alone. Ranger nudged Walter's knee under the table. Walter rested a hand against the dog's head. Warm fur, steady breathing, anchor point. When Walter finally left the diner, snow was falling harder. The cassette sat heavy in his coat pocket all the way back to the farmhouse. That night he carried an old tape player upstairs from a dusty bedroom closet and set it on the kitchen table. The house creaked softly around him, while Ranger curled near the doorway. Walter stared at the cassette for a long moment before sliding it into place. Then he pressed play. Static filled the kitchen first. A soft hiss. Then Earl Hayes cleared his throat somewhere inside the machine. Well, if this thing's playing, I guess Naomi finally ignored my instructions and handed it over. Walter froze. He had forgotten how rough Earl's voice sounded. Grovel and cigarettes. Like every word had to fight its way out. Ranger lifted his head near the doorway. Another crackle. I ain't real good at talking straight, Earl said. You already know that. Walter leaned back slowly in the kitchen chair. Outside, snow tapped lightly against the dark windows. I kept figuring we'd work things out face to face someday. But every year that passed, it got harder knowing where to start. Walter rubbed a hand over his mouth. The tape continued. When you came back from overseas, I didn't know what to say to you. A long pause followed. You looked at everything like it might explode. Walter shut his eyes briefly. Heat, dust, a road torn apart under a convoy truck. He could still smell it some nights. I kept thinking if I gave you enough space, maybe you'd settle back into yourself. Earl sighed softly. Truth is, I think I just made things quieter between us until quiet became normal. Ranger stood and crossed the kitchen slowly. He rested beside Walter's chair without making a sound. Walter's fingers settled automatically into the thick fur along the dog's neck. You were angry, Earl said. And I was proud. Bad combination for men like us. Walter laughed once under his breath. Short, bitter. The tape clicked softly as Earl shifted near the recorder. I know what folks around town say about me. Maybe some of it's true. I got stubborn after your mother died. Probably meaner, too. The farmhouse creaked in the wind. Walter stared at the peeling wallpaper across the kitchen. His mother used to hang photographs there every winter. Most were gone now. I kept those files because somebody had to, Earl continued. Half the people signing those contracts didn't understand what they were giving away. Some did understand. They just didn't have choices. Walter thought about the folders stacked downstairs. Widows, retired miners, families drowning in medical debt. I wasn't trying to save the valley, Earl said. Ain't that dramatic? I just didn't want people disappearing quietly. Walter swallowed hard. The words hit deeper than he expected. Another pause. Then Earl's voice lowered. Truth is, I think I saw too much of myself in some of those old folks. Walter looked toward the dark hallway. The house suddenly felt less haunted and more lonely. Like Earl had spent years talking to empty rooms. I know you thought I was disappointed in you. Walter's chest tightened instantly. Maybe I gave you every reason to think that. The tape hissed softly again. But I wasn't disappointed, son. I was scared. Walter blinked hard. You came home carrying things I couldn't reach. Every loud noise put you halfway out the door. Every stranger made you tense up like contact was coming. Walter looked down at his trembling hand. He hadn't even noticed it shaking. Ranger pressed harder against his leg. I figured if I pushed too hard, you'd leave again. Earl exhaled slowly. Turns out staying quiet didn't help either. Walter leaned forward, elbows against the table. The kitchen blurred slightly for a second. He forced himself to focus on the tape recorder, on Ranger breathing beside him, on the cold wood beneath his hands. Not the past. Here. Stay here. I should've told you I was proud, Earl said quietly. Walter stared at the machine like he might somehow see his father sitting there. You kept getting back up, Earl continued. That matters more than most things. The words broke something loose inside him. Not dramatic, not sudden tears. Just a slow collapse of weight he'd carried so long it stopped feeling separate from his bones. Walter lowered his head. For years he'd told himself Earl never understood him. Maybe Earl understood more than he knew how to say. The tape rolled on. If you found the cellar, then somebody probably noticed already. Walter's head lifted immediately. They've been sniffing around for years, not always directly. Sometimes it's offers, sometimes pressure, sometimes people pretending they're helping. Clay Mercer's calm smile flashed through Walter's mind. I don't know how far they'll push things now, Earl said. But don't mistake politeness for kindness where money's involved. Outside, wind rattled the loose porch screen sharply. Walter flinched before catching himself. Ranger immediately looked up. I'm all right, Walter whispered. The tape neared its end. I don't expect you to fix any of this, Earl said. Hell, maybe selling the place is smarter. Maybe you should run somewhere warmer and forget these hills altogether. Walter almost smiled at that. Sounded exactly like something Earl would say. But if you stay? Earl paused. Stay because it matters to you, not because of guilt. Guilt'll hollow a man out quicker than loneliness. Static filled the kitchen again. Then Earl spoke one final time. You always had a place here, Walter, even when neither of us knew how to act like it. The tape clicked off. Silence settled across the farmhouse, deep silence. Walter sat motionless for a long time. The storm outside had strengthened. Snow moved sideways past the windows now. Somewhere upstairs, old pipes knocked softly in the walls. Ranger rested his head across Walter's knee. Walter finally looked down at him. He really thought I was coming back someday. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. Walter laughed weakly through the tightness in his throat. You knew before I did, huh? The dog blinked slowly. Walter wiped a hand across his face and stood carefully. His knees ached from sitting too long. He walked toward the kitchen sink and stared out into the darkness beyond the yard. The south shed sat barely visible through the snow. For the first time since arriving, Walter no longer saw the property as a burden waiting to be unloaded. Now it looked like unfinished business that scared him more. Near midnight, he carried another armload of files upstairs from the cellar. Ranger followed close beside him with every trip. Walter spread papers across the kitchen table again. More names, more contracts, more notes from Earl. And underneath one stack, partially hidden beneath a county tax notice, Walter found a sealed envelope from the bank. Final notice of foreclosure review. Auction date pending. 3 weeks. Walter stared at the paper while wind moaned softly through the old farmhouse walls. 3 weeks before strangers could own everything. Earl spent years trying to protect. Ranger stood beside the table watching him carefully. Walter folded the notice slowly. Then he looked toward the dark window over the sink. For the first time in years, running suddenly felt harder than staying. Snow covered the valley by morning. Walter woke stiff on the living room couch, with Ranger stretched across the floor beside him. The fire had burned low during the night. Cold crept through the farmhouse walls again. For a second, Walter forgot where he was. Then the ceiling settled with a groan overhead. The old house came back to him, the tape, the foreclosure notice. 3 weeks. Ranger stood first and shook himself hard enough to rattle his collar. Yeah, Walter muttered. I know. Outside, the pasture looked pale beneath fresh snow. Tire tracks from the night visitor had disappeared completely. Walter brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. Tax notices, late fees, bank letters. Most of the debt wasn't enormous by itself, but piled together over years, it had become impossible for Earl to outrun. Walter rubbed his eyes. He had maybe $1,100 left between cash and the account tied to his VA disability checks. Not enough to save anything. Not enough to fix much, either. Ranger nudged his arm while Walter stared at the paperwork. You're optimistic for somebody with no income, Walter told him. The dog blinked slowly. By noon, Walter drove into town again. The courthouse sat at the far end of Main Street beside an old brick veterans memorial darkened by winter rain. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly over faded tile floors. Walter found the county records office nearly empty, except for a woman sorting files behind the counter. I'm trying to understand foreclosure timing on the Hayes property, he said. The woman typed for a moment before glancing up. You're Earl's son? Walter nodded. Auction filing's already in motion, she said gently. 3 weeks unless outstanding taxes and penalties are settled or legally contested. Contested how? You'd need an attorney. Walter almost laughed at that. Attorney money belonged to other people. Still, before leaving town, he stopped outside a narrow office above the hardware store. Turner Community Law. The sign looked old enough to collapse. Walter stood there a long moment before climbing the stairs. Inside smelled like dust and burnt coffee. A tall man with silver hair looked up from behind stacks of paperwork. Can I help you? Walter Hayes. Recognition crossed the man's face slowly. Earl's boy. Walter shifted slightly at the phrase. Guess so. The man introduced himself as Ben Turner and waved Walter into a chair. Walter explained the foreclosure notice first, then the boxes in the cellar, then Mercer Energy. Ben listened without interrupting. Only once Walter finished did the older man lean back and sigh. "Your father brought me some of those contracts years ago," Ben said. Walter looked up sharply. "You knew?" "Knew enough to understand. Earl thought folks around here were signing things they didn't fully understand." Ben removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "The problem is proving pressure after the fact, especially when people needed money badly enough to sign anyway." Walter pulled several contracts from his coat pocket and slid them across the desk. Ben read quietly for several minutes. The office clock ticked loud in the silence. Finally, Ben frowned. "Some of these notices may not have been properly served." "What does that mean?" "It means elderly property owners may never have received full disclosure before mineral rights transferred." Ben tapped one page carefully. "Not criminal necessarily, but questionable." Walter leaned back slowly. "So Earl wasn't imagining it?" "No," Ben said. "Your father was many things. Imagining problems usually wasn't one of them." That landed heavier than Walter expected. Ben continued flipping through the paperwork. "If Mercer Energy wants your land this badly, there's likely something strategic about the location." Walter thought about the shed being broken into. "They already took files." Ben's eyes narrowed. "You tell the sheriff?" Walter gave him a flat look. Ben nodded once, like he understood the answer without hearing it. Before Walter left, Ben handed him a business card. "You bring me whatever else Earl kept hidden," he said. "No promises, but I'll look." Walter hesitated. "I can't pay much," Ben snorted softly. "Neither could your father." Outside, the wind had picked up hard along Main Street. Walter crossed toward the truck while Ranger waited inside, watching every passerby through the windshield. As soon as Walter opened the passenger door, Ranger stepped out awkwardly, then stumbled. Walter frowned immediately. "Easy." The shepherd lifted one front paw slightly. Walter crouched beside him in the slush-covered parking lot. A small piece of glass sat lodged near Ranger's pad. Probably from the broken jar Walter knocked over near the shed the night before. Damn it. Ranger stayed perfectly still while Walter carefully worked the shard free. Only then did Walter realize how badly his own hands were shaking. Not from the cold. Fear. Simple and immediate. The idea of Ranger getting hurt tightened something in his chest faster than foreclosure notices or Mercer Energy ever had. Walter cleaned the paw with bottled water from the truck. "You're all right," he murmured more than once. Ranger licked his wrist once before climbing carefully back inside. That evening, Walter drove farther into the valley, visiting names from Earl's files. Most people were polite but cautious. An older couple, named the Harpers, invited him inside only after confirming he was Earl's son twice. Mrs. Harper served weak coffee while her husband stared at the floor. "Your daddy tried warning us," the old man admitted quietly. "I thought he was exaggerating." "You lose the land?" Walter asked. "Back acreage." Harper nodded slowly. "Coal rights first, then access roads." Mrs. Harper looked embarrassed even discussing it. "They make it sound temporary at first," she said. "Then lawyers start calling." At the next farmhouse, nobody answered the door despite a truck sitting outside. By sunset, Walter understood something clearly. People weren't just tired. They were ashamed. Ashamed they signed things. Ashamed they needed money. Ashamed they couldn't stop what followed. When Walter finally returned home, darkness had already swallowed the hills. Ranger limped slightly, crossing the yard. Walter noticed immediately. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, he cleaned the paw properly and wrapped it with gauze from an old first aid kit. Ranger endured the whole thing patiently. "You know," Walter said quietly, "you're about the only reason I haven't walked out of this valley again." Ranger rested his head against Walter's knee. The old tape recorder sat silent on the kitchen table nearby. Outside, wind pushed against the loose siding. Walter leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes briefly. No explosions tonight. No convoy dreams, just exhaustion. His phone buzzed suddenly against the table. Unknown number, Walter answered cautiously. Mr. Hayes, Clay Mercer, smooth as ever. I heard you've been asking questions around town. Walter stared toward the dark window. People talk. They do, Mercer agreed. That's why I'd advise you not to stir up old resentments. Doesn't help anyone. Walter's jaw tightened. You buying the property at auction? A short pause. If the bank proceeds, we may participate. Walter looked down at Ranger's bandaged paw. You seem awful interested in one broken-down farm. Mercer chuckled softly. Some ground matters more than it looks. The line went quiet for a second too long. Then Mercer spoke again. Your father had difficulty letting things go. I'd hate to see you inherit that habit. The call ended. Walter remained still after lowering the phone. Ranger lifted his head immediately, sensing the shift in him. For years, Walter thought fear always sounded loud. Gunfire, helicopters, men shouting over radios. But this kind felt quieter, polite, measured, and somehow colder. Later that night, while feeding wood into the stove, Walter heard headlights slow near the road outside the property. Not stopping, just slowing, watching. Ranger moved toward the window with a low growl. Walter stepped beside him. The truck disappeared around the bend after a few seconds. But sleep came harder after that. Near midnight, Walter sat alone at the kitchen table, reading another file from Earl's collection, when a folded note slipped loose from between the papers. One sentence written in hurried pencil. They threatened him after the county hearing. Walter stared at the line. No name attached, no explanation. Just fear trapped inside handwriting. Ranger rested his chin across Walter's boot. Outside, the valley stayed dark and silent. But for the first time, Walter began wondering if Earl's loneliness hadn't been loneliness at all. Maybe it had been pressure. The thought stayed him through the night. Wind rattled. The loose siding until nearly dawn. Ranger slept beside the couch, one paw still wrapped in gauze, ears twitching at every passing sound from the road. Walter barely slept at all. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Earl alone in this farmhouse sorting papers under weak kitchen light, while the rest of the valley slowly stopped answering his calls. By morning, the snow had turned wet and heavy. Walter stood at the sink, watching fog drift across the lower hills while coffee burned in the pot behind him. Ranger limped over slowly and rested against his leg. You and me both, Walter muttered. The dog's paw looked better already, though Walter still hated seeing him favor it. On the kitchen table sat 3 stacks of files Ben Turner asked him to bring into town later that afternoon. Walter gathered them carefully. Then Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the cellar door. Alert. Walter noticed it immediately. What is it? Ranger moved toward the hallway leading outside. Not aggressive. Curious. Walter followed him around the side of the farmhouse towards the south shed. The morning air smelled like wet dirt and wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys. Ranger circled the shed once before stopping near the back wall. There, half hidden behind stacked lumber and an old rusted feed barrel, sat a loose section of paneling Walter hadn't noticed before. Ranger pawed at it once. Walter crouched and pulled the board aside. Inside the narrow wall space sat several bundled envelopes tied together with faded twine. He stared at them a moment before carrying them into the house. Most were handwritten letters, different names, different years, all addressed to Earl Hayes. Walter opened the first carefully. Thank you for helping my mother understand what she signed. We would have lost everything sooner without you. Another read. I know folks think you're difficult, Earl, but you were the only one who explained the paperwork honestly. Walter sat down heavily at the kitchen table. There were dozens of them, some short, some barely legible, all from people Earl had helped quietly over the years. Ranger settled beside the chair while Walter kept reading. The old man had never mentioned any of this, not once. Walter remembered every argument instead, every slammed door, every cold silence after he came home from overseas angry at everything and everyone. Maybe Earl carried things quietly because he thought that was strength. Same as Walter. The realization sat hard in his chest. Around noon, he drove toward the far side of the county to meet a retired clerk Ben Turner mentioned over the phone. Name's Arthur Bell, Ben had said. Used to work county records before retirement. Earl trusted him. Arthur Bell lived alone in a narrow white farmhouse overlooking abandoned mining land. An old beagle barked weakly from the porch when Walter pulled in. Arthur answered the door wearing suspenders and thick glasses taped at one corner. You Hayes? The old man asked. Walter nodded. Arthur looked past him toward Ranger. That shepherd yours looks smarter than most county commissioners. Walter almost smiled. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. Arthur moved slowly but spoke sharp. Your father annoyed a lot of people, he said, while digging through a filing cabinet. Usually means he was paying attention. Walter stood quietly while Ranger lay near the heater vent. Arthur finally pulled out several photocopied county forms. These never should have matched, he said, sliding them across the table. Walter studied the papers. Dates had been changed on transfer filings. Notification periods shortened. One signature page appeared attached to two completely different contracts. Can they do that legally? Walter asked. Arthur snorted. Legally? No. Quietly? Happens more than folks think. Walter looked closer. Mercer energy appeared repeatedly. Arthur lowered his voice slightly. Your father started asking questions at county hearings maybe 12 years back. Folks laughed at him first. And later? They stopped laughing. The room fell quiet except for the ticking wall clock. Walter stared at the altered dates again. Not giant conspiracy stuff. Just small changes. Paperwork people ignored because life was busy and lawyers cost money. Enough small changes could bury a family. Arthur leaned back carefully in his chair. Earl made enemies because he embarrassed people. Nobody likes being reminded they signed away more than they understood. Walter folded the copies slowly. Did anybody threaten him? Arthur hesitated. That depends what you call a threat. Walter waited. County folks started avoiding him. Contractors stopped hiring him steady. A few people told him to quit stirring things up. Arthur shrugged lightly. In small towns, isolation works better than violence most times. Walter thought about the empty roads around the farmhouse, the late-night visitors, the pressure wrapped in politeness. Before leaving, Arthur handed Walter one last envelope. Your father left this with me years ago, he said. Told me to give it to you if things ever got ugly again. Walter frowned slightly. Again? Arthur's eyes softened. You don't remember how bad you looked after you came home. Walter looked away first. Outside, gray clouds pressed low across the hills. On the drive back, Walter stopped beside an overlook above the valley. Ranger climbed carefully from the truck and stood beside him. Below them stretched patchwork farmland, winding roads, church steeples, rusted rooftops, normal places, ordinary places. Walter finally understood why Earl fought so hard for them. Not because the land was valuable, because people on it mattered. Ranger nudged his hand gently. Walter scratched behind the dog's ears. "You knew before I did, didn't you?" The shepherd leaned into him slightly. Back at the farmhouse, Walter opened Arthur's envelope at the kitchen table. Inside sat another foreclosure notice. Recent. Mercer Energy Holdings officially registered as a participant in the upcoming auction. Walter stared at the page while rain began tapping softly against the windows. So, that was the plan. Wait for debt to finish what pressure started. Legally clean. Quiet enough nobody outside the valley would notice. Ranger suddenly stood and moved toward the cellar door again. Walter followed him downstairs. The old root cellar smelled damp and cool beneath the house. Ranger crossed directly toward the far wall where old shelves leaned crooked against stone. Then he stopped. Nose pressed low near the baseboards, Walter crouched beside him. "What now?" Ranger pawed once against loose wood near the bottom shelf. Walter pulled the shelf aside carefully. Behind it sat a narrow cavity cut into the stone wall. Inside were more envelopes. Not legal documents this time. Personal letters, Christmas cards, thank you notes, photographs of families standing beside barns, tractors, children, dogs, all the people Earl had helped. Walter sat quietly on the cellar floor while Ranger settled beside him. For years, Walter thought his father died angry at the world. But these hidden letters painted something different. A man who stayed because other people needed somebody stubborn enough not to leave. Walter picked up one faded photograph. Earl stood awkwardly beside an elderly couple in front of a small farmhouse, hands shoved deep into his pockets like he hated cameras. But he was smiling, small, real. Walter stared at that picture longer than any document in the cellar. Then he heard tires crunch slowly outside near the road. Ranger's ears snapped upright instantly. Walter looked toward the cellar stairs. The truck engine idled for several seconds before moving on. Watching again. Waiting. Walter folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. For the first time since returning home, he no longer felt trapped by Earl's past. Now he felt responsible for it. The church basement smelled like burnt coffee and wet coats. Walter stood near the folding tables, trying not to leave. That surprised him more than anything. 2 weeks ago, he would walked right back out the door before the first person looked his way. Now he stayed, because too many people had already stayed silent. Ranger lay beside his boots beneath the long table, where Ben Turner stacked copied records and county filings into neat piles. Outside, cold rain slid down the stained windows of the small Appalachian church. Pickup trucks filled the gravel lot. Folks moved slowly through the doorway in denim jackets and work boots, speaking low to each other. Nobody looked comfortable being there. Neither did Walter. Ben leaned closer. "We don't need speeches," he said quietly. "Just truth." Walter nodded once. Easy thing to say, harder thing to stand inside. At the far end of the room, Naomi Pierce poured coffee into paper cups, while several older couples flipped through copies of contracts Earl had saved. Walter noticed people recognizing their own names, their own signatures. Some looked angry, some embarrassed. Most looked tired. Ranger lifted his head suddenly. Walter turned toward the entrance. Clay Mercer had arrived. The room shifted almost immediately. Conversations lowered. A few people avoided eye contact altogether. Mercer removed his raincoat calmly and smiled like he belonged there. "Evening, folks." Nobody answered. Walter watched him walk toward the tables without hurry. Same polished boots, same controlled expression. Mercer glanced over the documents spread across the church tables. "You're making this into something uglier than it needs to be," he said. Ben folded his arms. "Public records tend to do that on their own." Mercer ignored him and looked directly at Walter. You really want strangers digging through your family's mess? Walter felt Ranger press lightly against his leg. Anchor point. Wasn't my family causing the mess? Walter replied quietly. Mercer sighed like a disappointed teacher. Your father spent years convincing vulnerable people they were victims. Naomi stepped forward before Walter could answer. My husband died owing medical bills, she said sharply. Earl's the reason I still own my diner. The room grew still. Mercer's smile tightened slightly. That's not the full story, Naomi. No, she snapped. The full story is folks around here were scared, and your company knew it. Walter watched several people glance nervously toward Mercer. Not fear exactly. Habit. Small-town habit. Don't make trouble. Don't stand out. Mercer turned back toward Walter again. You've had a rough few years, Mr. Hayes. His tone stayed smooth. Homeless veterans deserve compassion, not exploitation by local gossip. Walter felt heat rise instantly into his neck. There it was. Not direct aggression. Discrediting. Ranger stood slowly beside him. The shepherd's ears remained forward, eyes fixed on Mercer without blinking. Walter's breathing shortened before he realized it. Too many eyes. Too much noise. The church basement suddenly felt cramped and overheated. A chair scraped loudly somewhere behind him. His pulse jumped hard. For half a second, the room blurred into another crowded place years ago. Radios crackling, men shouting over each other, waiting for something bad to happen. Walter stepped backward automatically. Ranger immediately leaned harder into his leg. Stay here. Walter focused on the dog's breathing, on the wet smell of his fur, on the pressure against his knee, not the memory. The room slowly settled back into focus. Ben noticed. So did Naomi. Mercer definitely noticed. Walter straightened carefully. You think because I struggled after the military that nobody should listen to me? He asked quietly. Mercer spread his hands. I think pain can distort perspective. The silence afterward felt heavy. Then something unexpected happened. An older man near the coffee station cleared his throat. Earl tried warning me, he said, without looking at anyone directly. Walter recognized him from one of the files. Mr. Harper. The room shifted toward him. Harper kept speaking slowly. I signed papers I didn't understand after my wife got sick. He swallowed hard. Lost 40 acres 3 years later. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. Harper finally looked up. Earl was the only one who explained what I'd signed. Another voice came from near the back wall. A woman Walter barely recognized from town. Same thing happened to my brother. Then another. And another. Not dramatic speeches. Just tired people finally saying things out loud. Walter stood motionless listening, while the church basement filled with stories Earl had carried quietly for years. Naomi wiped her hands against her apron. People thought Earl liked fighting, she said softly. Truth is, he just hated watching folks get cornered. Mercer looked around the room carefully now. The calm salesman mask remained in place, but Walter saw calculation underneath it. This meeting wasn't going the way Mercer expected. Ben stepped beside the document table. We aren't accusing anybody of conspiracy, he said clearly. We're saying many residents signed agreements without proper understanding or representation. That deserves review before more land changes hands. Mercer gave a thin smile. You think county officials are going to reopen years of legal filings because a few unhappy landowners gathered in a church basement? No, Walter said quietly. The room turned toward him. Walter's hands trembled slightly, but his voice held. I think people deserve to know what happened before it keeps happening. The words surprised even him. Ranger rested against his boot again. Steady, present. Mercer studied Walter for several long seconds. Then he nodded once. Well, he said calmly, I suppose we'll see what survives public attention." He turned and walked toward the exit. Rain hammered harder outside as the church door shut behind him. The room remained silent for a moment afterward. Then conversation started again slowly. Quieter this time, but different. Not hidden anymore. Later that night, Walter drove back toward the farmhouse through thick fog, rolling across the mountain roads. Ranger slept in the passenger seat, exhausted from the long evening. Walter's chest still felt tight from standing before the crowd, but beneath the anxiety sat something unfamiliar. Relief. He had finally stopped hiding, too. When they reached the property, Walter immediately noticed something wrong. The barn light near the shed was out. He never left it off anymore. Walter parked fast and stepped into the cold rain. Ranger woke instantly and jumped down beside him. The mud around the shed had been churned up by truck tires. Fresh. Walter moved quicker now. The padlock hung broken from the latch. His stomach dropped. Inside, the smell hit first. Gasoline. Sharp and fresh. Walter swept his flashlight across the shed. One of the shelves had been overturned. Papers scattered across the floor. The old generator near the back wall sat dripping with fuel. Somebody had cut the fuel line deliberately. Ranger growled low near the cellar hatch. Walter crossed the room fast and yanked it open. The cellar below remained dark and silent, but several file boxes had been dragged halfway across the floor. Not stolen. Disturbed, like someone ran out of time. Rain hammered the tin roof overhead. Walter stood motionless, listening to it while Ranger scanned the darkness below. Then Walter noticed muddy footprints leading back upstairs, and one fresh cigarette still smoldering near the doorway. Whoever had been here had left only minutes earlier. Walter killed the flashlight. Ranger froze beside him instantly. Rain hammered the tin roof hard enough to blur smaller sounds, but Walter could still hear it underneath. Movement, somewhere beyond the shed. Slow, uneven. Walter's pulse sharpened. Not panic anymore. Focus. He crouched near the doorway while Ranger stood rigid beside the cellar hatch, nose aimed toward the woods behind the pasture. Another sound drifted through the rain. A boot slipping in mud. Walter stepped outside carefully. Cold rain soaked through his jacket immediately. The yard glistened silver beneath weak floodlight from the farmhouse porch. Ranger moved first, not charging, tracking. The shepherd crossed the yard low and fast toward the tree line beyond the barn. Walter followed. "Mr. Hayes," a voice suddenly called from the darkness. Drunk. Nervous. Walter stopped. Ranger growled low enough to vibrate through the rain. A man stumbled out from behind the tractor shed, holding both hands half raised. Mid-40s, maybe. Thin, wet denim jacket. Smelled like whiskey, even from several feet away. Walter recognized him after a second. Darren Pike, local handyman, occasional day laborer. The man looked terrified. "I wasn't trying to hurt nobody," Darren blurted out. Walter's jaw tightened. "Then why pour gasoline in my shed?" Darren swallowed hard. Rain ran down his face while he glanced toward the road like he expected somebody else to appear. "They told me just scare you some," he muttered. Ranger stepped forward one pace. Darren flinched immediately. Walter noticed the empty gas can near the man's boots. "You work for Mercer?" Darren shook his head too fast. No. I just do side jobs sometimes. They said you'd probably leave if things got rough." Walter stared at him. Not a hired killer. Just a broke man, making stupid choices for somebody with more money than him. That somehow made the whole thing uglier. "You burn those records and families lose proof," Walter said quietly. Darren looked ashamed now. "They already think you're gonna lose the place anyway." Walter almost laughed at that. The valley had spent years convincing itself defeat was practical. Ranger suddenly barked once toward the road. Headlights swept briefly across the lower field. Another truck slowing down, watching. Walter looked back at Darren. Sit down. What? Sit. Something in Walter's voice made the man obey immediately. Darren lowered himself onto an overturned bucket beneath the shed awning while rain drummed overhead. Walter called Ben Turner first, then Naomi, then finally the county sheriff's office. Not because he trusted them completely, because making this public mattered now. Ranger remained planted beside Darren the entire time, calm, alert, no lunging, no snapping, just enough presence to keep the man still. An hour later, Deputy Ellis arrived alone in an aging patrol truck. Older man, gray, mustache, tired eyes. He stepped carefully through the mud while Walter explained what happened. Ellis listened without interruption. Then he looked toward the scattered records inside the shed. Hell of a mess, he muttered. Darren kept staring at the ground. I didn't light nothing, he said quickly. I swear. No, Walter replied. You just poured fuel around the place in the middle of the night. Ellis sighed heavily. Darren, you've got to stop taking jobs when you're drinking. The man looked close to tears now. I needed money. Walter believed him. That was the worst part. Deputy Ellis finally led Darren toward the patrol truck while Ben Turner's pickup rolled slowly into the yard behind them. Ben climbed out, holding an umbrella against the rain. When he saw the shed, his face darkened immediately. They escalated faster than I expected, he said quietly. Walter crossed his arms against the cold. They didn't expect people talking publicly. Ben nodded once. That church meeting rattled them. Ranger limped slightly while circling the yard. Walter noticed immediately. The bandaged paw had soaked through again in the rain. Come here, Walter murmured. Ranger obeyed at once. Walter crouched beneath the shed awning, checking the paw carefully while Ben looked through the disturbed file boxes. No serious damage. Still, Walter hated seeing the shepherd hurt. You always check me before yourself, Ben observed quietly. Walter kept his eyes on Ranger. He's earned it. Rain softened near dawn. By then, Naomi had arrived carrying fresh coffee and dry towels. 2 local reporters from a regional paper showed up shortly after sunrise, after Ben made several phone calls. Nothing national, nothing dramatic. Just local journalists photographing muddy footprints, scattered records, broken locks, and fuel-soaked concrete floors. Real things, visible things. The kind harder to dismiss. Walter hated every second cameras pointed his way. Crowds still tightened his chest. Questions still made him feel cornered. But he stayed. Ranger stayed closer. One reporter asked quietly, why not just sell the property and move on? Walter looked past her toward the wet hills behind the farmhouse. Because 2 weeks ago that answer would have been easy. Now it wasn't. My father spent years trying to keep people from getting pushed around quietly, Walter finally said. Guess I understand that better now. The reporter lowered her notebook slightly. No grand speech, no dramatic music moment. Just truth spoken by a tired man standing in rain beside a half-broken shed. By afternoon, the story had already spread through town. People started stopping by the property. Some brought old documents for Ben Turner to review. Some only brought coffee. One elderly woman handed Walter a photograph Earl once repaired for her after a house fire. He never charged me, she said softly. Walter didn't know what to say to any of it. For years, he thought Earl died isolated because nobody cared. Now he realized Earl had mattered quietly to more people than either of them understood. Late that evening, Ben returned from town carrying fresh paperwork. Walter sat at the kitchen table, drying Ranger's paw carefully, while the old shepherd rested his chin across Walter's thigh. Ben removed his coat. "You're not gonna like this," he said. Walter looked up. "Mercer Energy withdrew from the auction this afternoon." Walter blinked once. "What?" "Too much attention now." Ben set the papers down. Between the church meeting, the attempted vandalism, and county records questions, their lawyers probably decided this property became more trouble than profit. Walter leaned back slowly. The room felt strangely quiet after that. No victory cheering, no triumphant relief, just exhaustion. Ranger lifted his head slightly, sensing the shift. "So what happens now?" Walter asked. Ben gave a tired smile. "Bank postponed the foreclosure review, pending a legal evaluation." He shrugged lightly. "Means you bought yourself time. Time." Walter looked around the farmhouse kitchen. The peeling cabinets, the cracked floor tiles, the tape recorder still sitting beside stacks of Earl's files. Weeks ago, this place felt like a graveyard waiting to be abandoned. Now it felt different. Wounded, maybe, but alive. After Ben left, Walter stepped onto the porch alone. Rain clouds were finally breaking apart above the mountains. Cool night air rolled across the valley, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. Ranger limped out beside him and settled near the porch steps. Walter looked down at the dog. "You could had a warmer life somewhere else, too." Ranger rested his head against Walter's knee. Lights glowed faintly across distant farms scattered through the hills. People still awake. People Earl once tried protecting. Walter finally understood something simple. Staying had never really been about winning. It was about refusing to disappear quietly. As he turned to head back inside, Ranger suddenly stopped near the shed again. The shepherd sniffed near the outer wall, where rain had loosened old wood panels. Walter walked over slowly. Behind one warped board sat a narrow, hidden space Earl had sealed years earlier. Inside waited a single envelope. Walter pulled it free carefully. His name was written across the front in Earl's rough handwriting. The last thing his father had hidden. Walter carried the envelope into the farmhouse carefully, like it might fall apart in his hands. Rain still tapped softly against the porch roof outside. Ranger followed close beside him, limping less now, but staying near enough to brush Walter's leg every few steps. Inside, the kitchen felt warmer than it had in weeks. Not because the house changed, because Walter had. He sat down slowly at the old table beneath the weak overhead light and opened the envelope. One folded letter, nothing else. The paper smelled faintly of dust and motor oil. Walter unfolded it carefully. "Son, if you're reading this, then you stayed longer than I figured you would." Walter let out a breath through his nose. That sounded exactly like Earl. "I used to think surviving meant handling everything alone. Your granddad believed that, so did I. Maybe men in this family confuse silence with strength." Walter stared at the words while Ranger settled heavily beside the chair. "After you left, I kept expecting the phone to ring one day, with you telling me where you ended up. Never blamed you for leaving. Truth is, if I'd come home carrying what you carried, I probably would have run too." Walter swallowed hard. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees behind the shed. The letter continued. "I know this land ain't worth much money compared to what companies offered folks around here. But that's never why I stayed. Some ground matters because people need somewhere that still feels honest." Walter looked around the kitchen slowly. Cracked cabinets, worn linoleum, the old tape recorder near the sink. Nothing impressive. Still home. "I kept the key because I hoped maybe someday you'd need proof there was still a place left for you, too." Walter lowered the paper slightly. For years, he thought Earl only left him debts, arguments, and silence. Now he understood. The old man left him a reason to stop drifting. Near the bottom of the letter, Earl's handwriting grew shakier. Don't spend the rest of your life running from ghosts. They never get tired. You will. Walter closed his eyes briefly. The words landed deep because they were true. The last line sat alone beneath everything else. Take care of that dog. He already knows more than both of us. Walter laughed quietly through the tightness in his chest. Ranger lifted his head immediately at the sound. Yeah, Walter whispered. He usually does. Weeks passed after that. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the valley. Snow retreated from the hillsides first, leaving muddy roads and pale grass beneath. The foreclosure proceedings stalled under legal review once. Ben Turner and several residents filed formal complaints about older land agreements. Mercer Energy stopped calling, stopped driving past the property too. Not because everything suddenly became perfect, because attention made quiet pressure harder to hide. Walter stayed busy. That mattered. He repaired loose fencing first, then patched part of the barn roof before spring rain ruined it completely. Ranger followed him everywhere despite the lingering stiffness in his paw. Most mornings, Walter woke before sunrise out of habit. Sometimes nightmares still dragged him awake, breathing hard and searching dark corners before memory settled back into place. But now Ranger no longer had to pull him out alone. The farmhouse itself helped, routine helped, work helped. One Saturday afternoon, Naomi arrived carrying sandwiches while Ben hauled old lumber from his truck bed. You know, Naomi said, looking around the cleaned-out workshop beside the shed. This place almost looks useful again. Walter snorted softly. Don't insult the building. Ben leaned against the doorway. You serious about this idea? Walter looked around the workshop slowly. The old workbench had been rebuilt, shelves repaired, tools organized for the first time in years. Yeah, he said. I think so. The idea started small, just offering free space on weekends for folks needing repairs done. Lawn mowers, generators, farm equipment. Then a younger veteran named Caleb showed up, asking if Walter knew basic welding. A week later, another man came, needing help fixing a transmission, but mostly looking for somewhere quiet to sit without questions. Word spread slowly after that, not through newspapers, through people. By late spring, the Old South shed no longer felt hidden underground from the world. Now it sounded alive, metal clanging, low, conversation, coffee brewing somewhere nearby. Ranger usually lay near the doorway, watching everyone come and go, like a tired security guard who never fully clocked out. The shepherd had gone gray around the muzzle during the winter. He moved slower too. But every morning he still made the same patrol around the property before settling beside the workshop entrance. Walter noticed people trusted the place faster once they trusted the dog. Maybe because Ranger never judged anybody walking through the door. One afternoon, while helping a teenager repair an old chainsaw, Walter suddenly realized he hadn't thought about leaving the valley in weeks. The realization startled him more than it should have. That evening, he walked out toward the south, shed alone while the mountains glowed gold beneath the setting sun. Ranger followed slowly behind. Walter stepped inside the workshop and looked at the far wall. The rusted iron key now hung there above the workbench. Cleaned slightly, but still rough, still scarred. He reached up and touched it lightly. Not treasure, not evidence, just proof a locked place finally opened. Ranger settled beside the doorway with a tired groan. Walter smiled faintly. You picked the right shed after all. The dog's tail thumped once against the floorboards. Voices drifted from outside where Naomi laughed at something Ben said near the trucks. Normal sounds, human sounds, The kind that once made Walter feel disconnected from the rest of the world. Now they grounded him. Healing hadn't arrived like lightning. No dramatic breakthrough. No perfect ending. Some nights the dream still came. Some mornings crowds still tightened his chest. Some scars stayed exactly where they were. But Walter finally understood healing wasn't about becoming the man he used to be. It was about becoming somebody willing to stay. He looked one last time at the key hanging above the bench. Earl never left him money, never left comfort either. What he left was harder to recognize. A place, a purpose, and the reminder that people written off as difficult, broken, or forgotten are often just carrying too much silence alone. Outside, evening settled softly across the valley. Ranger rose carefully and walked toward the door. Walter followed him out into the fading light, and for the first time in years, going home no longer felt like retreat. It felt like standing his ground. Maybe that was the real thing Earl left behind. Not the house, not the land, not even the key hanging on the workshop wall. He left Walter proof that broken people are not useless people. Some folks carry pain so long they stop knowing how to speak it out loud. Veterans, old farmers, men who bury grief under silence because they think nobody wants to hear it anyway. And sometimes healing does not begin with a big victory. Sometimes it starts with one loyal dog refusing to leave your side. One person choosing to stay instead of run. One old shed turning back into a place where people feel useful again. Ranger never fixed Walter's past. He simply reminded him every day that he did not have to face it alone. That kind of loyalty changes a man. If this story meant something to you, type 1 in the comments. And if you believe people deserve a second chance before the world gives up on them, type 0. We'd also love to know where you're watching from tonight. And if you enjoy stories like this, quiet stories about loyalty, healing, and ordinary people trying to hold on to something good, stick around and subscribe. There are more roads ahead, and more stories waiting by the fire.